All right, ready to go deep. Today, we're plunging headfirst into the interwar period.
Ooh, that's a good one. The interwar period. That chaotic time between World War I and World War II. We're talking 1919 to 1939, a time of, well, you know, immense hope, but also, as we know, devastating failures that ultimately led to another global conflict.
Yeah, it's a period packed with lessons for anyone trying to make sense of international relations, especially for, first-year IR students.
Absolutely. It really is. It's kind of like having, different pairs of glasses, each pair revealing a unique aspect of the same complex picture. And today we're going to use those lenses, those theoretical lenses like realism, liberalism, constructivism, and critical theories to examine the events that ultimately led up to World War II.
Okay, so let's start with realism, which, if I remember correctly, is all about power dynamics, right?
Yeah, it's like a giant global chessboard where every country is maneuvering for advantage.
Exactly, yeah.
Realists, they put a lot of emphasis on the concept of anarchy in the international system, meaning there's no world government to enforce rules, so states are ultimately responsible for their own security, looking out for number one. And, well, this often leads to what we call a security dilemma.
Ah, the security dilemma. Okay, so that's when, even if a state built up its military just for like defensive reasons, right?
Right.
It could still be perceived as a threat by neighboring countries. And then that leads to, that dangerous spiral of insecurity and escalation.
Exactly. And the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended World War I, well, that's a classic example of how peace treaties with the best intentions can sometimes actually sow the seeds of future conflict.
Okay, so unpack that for me a little bit. How did Versailles contribute to that instability we saw in the interwar period?
Well, you see, the treaty, while aiming to punish Germany for its role in the war, imposed really harsh reparations, financial penalties, and also significant territorial losses on Germany. So that left Germany with, understandable resentment and a strong desire to overturn that international order that they saw as deeply unfair.
So it seems like, at least from a realist perspective, the victors didn't do a great job of balancing power in Europe after the war, right?
That's one of the big critiques, yeah. The treaty weakened Germany in the short term. But it didn't eliminate its potential to kind of bounce back and reassert itself on the world stage. And then you have other powers like Japan who are feeling increasingly excluded from the established order, and that fueled their own revisionist ambitions. Like, think about it, Japan's rapid industrialization, their growing economic and military power, yet they're still looking for resources, recognition on the world stage, but they're kind of told, hey, you're not quite good enough for the big boys club yet. And that frustration fueled their expansionist desires and a willingness to directly challenge that existing power structure.
So you've got these disgruntled powers with growing strength. But on the other hand, you have Britain and France, the traditional powerhouses. Were they in any position to contain these rising powers?
Well, the thing is, both Britain and France were significantly weakened by World War I. They were dealing with their own internal economic challenges. Britain had their huge empire, which was becoming increasingly difficult to manage, and France had suffered huge losses in the war. Casualties were immense. So understandably, they were really wary of another major war. And then you add to that the U.S. kind of retreating into isolationism after the war. You basically had a recipe for a dangerous power vacuum on the world stage.
No one to really step in and maintain order, right?
Exactly.
So how did this power vacuum, combined with that, ever-present security dilemma, actually play out in the 1930s?
Well, think about Germany under Hitler. I mean, his rearmament program and expansionist policies were really alarming to neighboring countries. But then any response they took, like forming alliances or trying to build up their own defenses, just kind of reinforced that whole cycle of fear and mistrust.
And that brings us to appeasement, right? This idea that, okay, maybe if we give Hitler a little bit of what he wants, maybe we can avoid another war.
Right. Exactly. And from a realist perspective, appeasement was a total miscalculation. It basically signaled weakness and a lack of resolve, which just emboldened Hitler to push even further. Remember, realists believe that credible threats are key to deterring aggression. But Hitler, he saw the reluctance of Britain and France to engage in another war, and he really exploited their hesitation for his own advantage.
So even though appeasement might have seemed like a, peaceful strategy at the time, it kind of backfired
Yeah.
because it never really addressed those underlying power dynamics or Hitler's real ambitions.
Exactly. You've got to address the root of the problem. And then, well, of course, we have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? That non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939.
Oh, yeah. The pact that allowed Hitler to conquer Poland without worrying about the Soviets intervening.
Yeah, and that really set the stage for the outbreak of World War II.
Which, when you think about it, it seems counterintuitive. Like these two ideological rivals, they hate each other's guts, but then they suddenly cut a deal.
Well, that's realpolitik in action. Realists argue that states are going to prioritize their immediate security needs over their ideological differences, even if it seems strained.
Right, like the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing.
Exactly. For Stalin, that pact bought him time to strengthen the Soviet military and expand his territory. And for Hitler, well, he secured his eastern border so that he could focus on launching his war in the West. It was a cold-blooded, calculated move based on power and survival. It's a classic example of realism playing out in the real world.
So, in essence, realism highlights how the interwar period was really a time of, well, shifting power dynamics, miscalculations, and the brutal logic of self-preservation.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that in a world without a global policeman, someone to enforce the rules, states have to carefully navigate a really complex and dangerous landscape. But as you mentioned earlier, realism isn't the only way to understand these events. We have to, try on those other lenses too. So next, let's explore how liberalism interprets the interwar period and the road to war.
Perfect. I'm ready to switch lenses. Now, liberalism, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's all about cooperation, institutions, that whole idea that democracies are less likely to fight each other.
Right, that's the basic gist.
So how does this perspective grapple with the fact that World War II, this huge conflict, actually broke out?
Well, you see, for liberals, the interwar period represents a pretty profound failure of those international institutions and those core principles that they were designed to uphold. The League of Nations, created after World War I with that really noble goal of preventing future wars through collective security, well, it ultimately proved unable to actually stop aggression.
Yeah, the League of Nations. It was a bold experiment for sure. Can you break down its major flaws, especially from that liberal perspective?
Well, one of the main problems was that it relied on unanimous agreement before any action could be taken. That meant that any member could veto a decision. And that made it really hard to respond quickly and decisively to a crisis. Take the Manchurian crisis in 1931, for example. Japan invades Manchuria, and the League condemns the action, but they can't agree on any effective sanctions. And part of that was because individual members had their own interests, that sometimes clashed with the idea of collective action.
So it's kind of like collective action was hampered by, the need to please everybody.
Yeah.
Giving each state way too much power to kind of derail a collective response.
Exactly. It's like herding cats, trying to get everyone on the same page. And then, well, there's the whole issue of enforcement, right? The League didn't have its own military force. They relied on member states to contribute troops, which, let's be honest, they were often reluctant to do. It was basically a system built on trust and goodwill, which, as we saw, was really inadequate when you're facing determined aggressors who just aren't playing by the same rules.
Right. Yeah, it's like having a police force without any officers to patrol the streets.
Perfect analogy.
Good one. Right. And all these failures really exposed a kind of fundamental tension within liberalism, right? That difficulty of reconciling the sovereignty of individual states with the need to take collective action to actually address global challenges.
Exactly. And it's a dilemma that we still struggle with today, in different forms. But, those weren't the only challenges liberalism faced during this era. We can't forget the Great Depression, which started in 1929, and it dealt a devastating blow to that whole idea of a liberal world order.
Right, because it shattered economic interdependence. That very thing liberals believe can kind of, help to mitigate conflict by creating shared interests and that sense of shared prosperity.
Exactly. So you have economies around the world collapsing and countries, well, they turn inward. They start adopting more protectionist policies like tariffs and devaluing their currencies, trying to make their exports more competitive. Instead of international cooperation and trade, there was a surge of economic nationalism, a beggar-thy-neighbor approach that just fractured the international system even further.
It's like that classic case of short-term self-interest undermining those long-term benefits of cooperation.
Exactly. And this upheaval, this economic upheaval, it had these huge political consequences. It fueled social unrest, political instability, and led to the rise of, those extremist ideologies that really challenged that liberal world order. Think about Germany. The economic crisis played a massive role in the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the rise of, well, who, Hitler and the Nazi Party.
So basically, the economic crisis not only undermined international cooperation, it weakened democracies internally,
Yeah.
making them more vulnerable to internal and external threats.
Yeah, that's a really key insight. And this leads us to another important aspect of that liberal perspective, which is the democratic peace theory. That idea that, okay, well, democracies are less likely to fight each other, but, the interwar period paints a really mixed picture on that one.
Right, because while those major democracies back then, they didn't go to war with each other directly,
Hmm.
you also see this really scary rise of those totalitarian regimes in countries like Italy, Germany, and Japan.
Exactly. And this shift towards authoritarianism really raises some tough questions for liberals about the ability of democracies to respond to threats effectively and in a timely and decisive manner.
Right, because democracies are built on deliberation and debate and that whole process of consensus building,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And those things, while essential for legitimacy, can be slow and cumbersome, especially when you're facing those fast-moving crises.
Yeah, it's almost like democracies, with their aversion to war and their need for public support, they were kind of playing by a different set of rules than those authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, like they're operating at a disadvantage in a world where speed and secrecy and that ability to just act decisively are increasingly valued.
Right. And the authoritarian regimes really exploited this. They used propaganda, manipulation, military force to expand their power.
So while liberalism offered this, really compelling vision for a peaceful and cooperative world order, the interwar period kind of exposed its vulnerabilities,
Hmm.
both in terms of, institutional design, but also the challenges of democratic decision-making in a crisis. It's a really sobering reminder that even the best intentions can sometimes falter in the face of those complex realities.
Absolutely. And it just highlights the need to always be vigilant and adapt, always
Yeah,
be willing to learn from those past mistakes.
right.
But let's not forget, realism and liberalism, they're just two pieces of the puzzle. We've still got constructivism and critical theory to explore.
Right. I can't wait to dive into those next. I'm really intrigued to see how constructivism sheds light on everything we've been talking about. But for now, let's take a break and come back with fresh minds for part 2 of our deep dive into the interwar period.
Welcome back, deep divers. Now let's explore a different perspective, constructivism, which argues that the world isn't just about, raw power and self-interest like the realists suggest, or even just institutions like the liberals emphasize.
Okay, so if it's not about those things, what does constructivism focus on then?
Well, it really emphasizes the role of ideas, norms, and even identities in shaping how countries behave on the world stage. Think about it this way. The interwar period wasn't just about those shifting power dynamics, right?
Right.
It was also this battleground of competing ideologies. You had communism taking root in the Soviet Union, fascism spreading in Italy and Germany, and various forms of nationalism popping up all over the globe.
So it was like this time of intense ideological ferment, right? You have all these different visions of political and social order kind of battling it out for dominance.
Exactly. And these ideologies weren't just some abstract theories. They had really profound implications for how states behaved, how they interacted. Remember, Nazi Germany's ideology of racial superiority and their belief in their destiny to dominate Europe? Well, that clashed directly with those liberal democratic values of self-determination and individual rights.
So essentially you're saying that these competing worldviews, these clashing identities, they actually helped contribute to the outbreak of war.
Absolutely. And one of the most, I think, striking examples of this is the failure of the Kellogg-Briand Pact back in 1928. It was this multilateral agreement, signed by a whole bunch of countries, including Germany, that basically renounced war as an instrument of national policy.
Okay, that sounds great on paper, but obviously it didn't work. Why not?
Well, you see, constructivists would argue that although these states signed the pact, they didn't really internalize those norms. They still saw war as this legitimate option, especially when it came to defending what they saw as their interests or promoting their ideologies. They found all these ways to justify their aggression. They'd create these narratives of self-defense or liberation, essentially twisting the meaning of the pact to fit their own goals.
So it's a classic case of, saying one thing but doing another.
Exactly. Like a big performance on the world stage.
Lots of hypocrisy, right?
Lots of hypocrisy. And it highlights this really key constructivist insight. Norms aren't static. They're not self-enforcing, right? They're constantly being contested, interpreted, and even reshaped through these interactions between states. The Kellogg-Briand Pact, it just shows that simply signing an agreement isn't enough. You need that shared understanding of what it means, a willingness to uphold those principles even when it's hard.
That makes sense. But, beyond this clash of ideologies, are there any other, constructivist insights that help us understand that kind of slide towards war?
Well, think about the economic realm. The interwar period also saw this clash between different visions of how the global economy should be organized. You had people promoting free trade, this idea of laissez-faire capitalism, arguing that, minimal government intervention would just lead to prosperity for everyone.
Right.
But you also had, the rise of state-controlled economies, especially in the Soviet Union, and of course, a big surge of economic nationalism as countries really struggled to cope with the fallout from the Great Depression.
So it's not just about countries battling over their political systems. They're also fighting over the right way to manage their economies.
Exactly. And these economic visions weren't just about those, technical differences or policy preferences. They reflected really different fundamental beliefs about the role of the state, the distribution of wealth, and how nations should relate to each other in this economic sphere.
It's amazing how constructivism reveals these deeper layers of meaning, right?
Yeah.
It's like we're not just looking at actions, but also at those ideas and beliefs that are driving those actions.
And there's even more to it than that. Constructivists also emphasize the power of memory and symbols, how those things can shape international relations.
Okay.
Think about how different countries interpreted that legacy of World War I, right?
Right.
For some, it was a tragedy, a senseless tragedy, something that should never be repeated.
Right.
But for others, it was a victory that needed to be defended or a humiliation that fueled this deep resentment and a desire for revenge.
So you're saying that the way countries remember and frame the past actually influences how they behave in the present.
Absolutely. For example, you have Germany's sense of victimhood and humiliation after World War I, right? Fueled by those harsh terms of the Versailles Treaty. Well, that played a huge role in the rise of nationalist sentiment and the appeal of Hitler's message, to restore Germany to greatness.
It's almost like those historical memories create this powerful narrative that shapes public opinion and can ultimately lead to policy decisions.
Exactly. And that's where the power of symbols comes in. Think about the swastika, the symbol of Nazi Germany. It wasn't just some random design.
Right.
It evoked this whole sense of history, heritage, national identity. And the Nazis used it to really mobilize support for their regime and their expansionist goals.
It's so interesting how something as, seemingly simple as a symbol can become so charged with meaning, right?
Right.
And end up playing such a huge role in shaping these world events.
Absolutely. And even the language that we use in international politics matters. Think about terms like, international community versus racial hierarchy. These terms reflect totally different understandings of how the world works and what is considered acceptable behavior.
Okay, so to kind of sum this all up, constructivism is essentially saying that the interwar period was shaped not just by, material power and military strength, but also by this battle of ideas, identities, memories, and even the way we use language to make sense of the world around us.
That's a great summary. It's a reminder that international relations aren't just about states pursuing their interests in this cold, calculated way, right? It's also about the ideas that motivate those interests, the norms that govern behavior, and the identities that shape how states see themselves and others. And all those factors played a really crucial role in those events leading up to World War II.
Okay, before we jump to that final theoretical lens, can you give me an example of how these competing ideas played out in, a more concrete way during this period, something to really bring this perspective to life?
Sure. Consider the different responses to the rise of fascism in Europe. You had countries like Britain and France, right? They were still holding on to those ideals of liberal internationalism, hoping to appease Hitler to preserve peace. But on the other hand, you had the Soviet Union viewing fascism as an existential threat to their communist ideology and actively supporting anti-fascist movements all across Europe.
Okay.
And these different reactions weren't simply driven by, just strategic calculations or just power politics. They were deeply influenced by each country's own ideology and how they understood that fascist threat.
That's a perfect illustration. Okay, I'm ready to dive into our final theoretical perspective, critical theory. This one, if I remember correctly, really challenges those traditional assumptions about power and how the world works.
It does.
So what can it tell us about the interwar period?
Well, critical theory, and especially those strands drawing from Marxism and post-colonialism, They argue that we can't fully understand this period without looking at those deeper structures of inequality and exploitation that really shaped it. For critical theorists, the interwar period wasn't just about the failure of diplomacy or a clash of ideologies. It was about those inherent contradictions of a global system that was built on imperialism and capitalism.
Okay, let's break that down. How did imperialism in particular factor into this equation? I mean, wasn't World War I supposed to usher in this new era of self-determination and, bring an end to empires?
In theory, yes, but critical theorists argue that the Versailles Treaty, while it was promoting self-determination on the surface, actually reinforced those imperial power structures in a lot of ways. Take the mandate system, for example. It gave Britain and France control over those former Ottoman and German territories in the Middle East and Africa, essentially continuing that exploitation of colonized people just under a new name.
So it's basically colonialism in disguise.
Exactly, like putting lipstick on a pig.
Right. And those inequalities, they became even more obvious during the Great Depression. As that global economy crashed, imperial powers tightened their grip on their colonies, right? Extracting resources to try and prop up their own struggling economies at the expense of those colonized populations.
It's like the crisis just exposed that inherent brutality of the whole imperial system, even as it tried to present this more liberal and progressive face to the world.
Exactly. Critical theorists would argue that the crisis of the interwar period was, in a lot of ways, a crisis of the imperial system itself. A system that was built on extracting wealth and resources from what we now call the global south to benefit those wealthy nations in the north.
That makes me think about those anti-colonial movements that were gaining momentum during this period. Were they seen as part of this broader critique of the international system?
Absolutely. Think about the Indian independence movement with Gandhi at the helm, or the growing resistance to French rule in Indochina. These movements weren't just about national liberation, they were challenging that whole structure of imperial domination. So they were basically exposing that hypocrisy of a system that was preaching self-determination for some, but denying it to millions of others under colonial rule.
Exactly. And critical theorists would argue that these anti-colonial struggles were totally intertwined with the events unfolding in Europe. The crises of the interwar period weren't just European crises. They were global crises, with those ripple effects felt all across that colonized world. To really understand the lead up to World War II, you have to consider those global dynamics of inequality and resistance.
So we're starting to see a much more interconnected picture of this period, right?
Yeah.
One that goes beyond that traditional focus on European diplomacy and the actions of those great powers.
Precisely. And now let's bring capitalism into the mix. How do critical theorists connect that system to the outbreak of World War II?
Okay, I'm ready to connect the dots. Lay it on me.
All right, from a Marxist perspective, imperialism wasn't just about political control, it was about economic exploitation too. Colonies, they provided raw materials, cheap labor, those captive markets for those capitalist economies of Europe.
So it was about securing profits, right? Getting those resources to fuel the engine of capitalist growth.
Exactly. And when the Great Depression hit, all those contradictions of capitalism, they became even more obvious. Countries turned to, economic nationalism, protectionism, trying to secure their own interests in a world where the pie was suddenly shrinking.
So instead of cooperation and shared prosperity, you had this desperate scramble for resources and markets, which just made those tensions and those rivalries even worse.
Yes, exactly. And this, according to those critical theorists, is where fascism comes in. They see the rise of fascist regimes in Italy, Germany, and Japan as a response to that crisis of capitalism.
So they're saying fascism wasn't just some random aberration, it was a symptom of this deeper systemic malfunction.
Right, yeah.
A product of the inherent instability of capitalism itself.
That's the argument. Fascist regimes, with their emphasis on militarism, expansionism, and state control of the economy, were seen as this way to kind of resolve those contradictions of capitalism, but through force and conquest.
So Hitler's push for Lebensraum, living space in Eastern Europe, wasn't just about ideology or nationalism. It was about securing resources and markets for a German economy that was really struggling within the constraints of that global capitalist system.
Exactly. And Japan's expansion into Manchuria and China can be seen in a similar light. Critical theorists argue that these aggressive actions were fueled by the logic of capitalist imperialism, a logic that really prioritized profit and expansion, even if it meant war.
This is such a different way of looking at the causes of World War II. Instead of just focusing on individual leaders or diplomatic blunders, we're seeing it as a product of these deeper almost invisible systemic forces.
Right. And critical theorists don't stop there. They also point out that even seemingly progressive institutions like the League of Nations were often complicit in perpetuating racial hierarchies and inequalities.
So even the institutions that were, specifically designed to promote peace and cooperation, they were tainted by that legacy of colonialism and racial prejudice.
Exactly. Remember the mandate system? We talked about it earlier, right? It was based on this idea that certain people weren't capable of governing themselves yet. They needed the guidance of European powers. And even within the League itself, there were these clear hierarchies of power and influence, where those Western nations really held most of the sway.
So the whole system was kind of rigged from the start, even when it was trying to present itself as this, benevolent force for good.
Yeah, that's a powerful insight from the critical perspective. They're always reminding us to look beyond the surface, to question those power structures that shape our world. Don't just take things at face value.
It's crazy to consider how differently these theoretical lenses, interpret the same historical period. We've covered so much ground today, from, power politics and the security dilemma to the clash of ideologies, those legacies of imperialism.
And we're not quite done yet. There's one more piece of that critical theory puzzle to explore. And it's all about how the legacies of that interwar period continue to shape the world we live in today. It's not just ancient history. It's still relevant.
Wait, there's more. I'm already feeling like my brain is, about to explode with all these insights. But all right, I'm ready for that final piece of the puzzle. Let's do it.
All right, we're back, ready to wrap up our exploration of the interwar period. We've journeyed through realism, liberalism, constructivism, and now we're finishing with critical theory. That perspective that pushes us to think about those deep-rooted structures of power and inequality that we don't always see.
Right, and as we get into this last part, it's really important to see how critical theory connects that interwar period to the present day. It's not just about, dissecting the past. It's about understanding how those legacies of imperialism, global capitalism, they're still shaping the world that we live in. So you're saying that even though the world has seemingly moved on, those echoes from the past are still influencing things today, kind of like a ripple effect that just keeps spreading outwards.
Exactly. Let's take decolonization, for example, that process that happened after World War II. While it led to formal independence for a lot of former colonies, critical theorists would argue that it didn't necessarily dismantle those underlying economic and power structures of that old imperial system. Many former colonies remained economically dependent on their former rulers, often trapped in those unequal trading relationships or burdened by debt.
So it's like changing the label on the bottle without actually changing the contents. Like the power dynamics remain, even though the political map has been redrawn.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Think about the Bretton Woods institutions. Those were established in 1944 to manage the post-war global economy, right?
Right, the IMF, the World Bank.
Yeah. Exactly. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, they were designed to, promote stability and development. But critics argued that they often ended up reinforcing the dominance of those wealthy nations, imposing policies that really benefited Western interests, sometimes at the expense of those developing countries.
It feels like that old saying, meet the new boss, same as the old boss.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, yeah. Even the United Nations, created with that noble goal of preventing another world war, it didn't fully escape those shadows of the past. I mean, think about the Security Council with its permanent members and their veto power. It still reflects those power dynamics from the post-World War II era. The victors of that conflict, those major powers, they still hold a lot of influence over international peace and security.
So those echoes of the interwar period, those legacies of imperialism and those unequal power structures, they're still kind of embedded in the institutions and systems that govern global politics today. It's like we're still wrestling with the ghosts of empires past.
That's a key takeaway from the critical perspective.
Yeah.
It really pushes us to think critically about how, these seemingly neutral institutions and policies might actually be perpetuating those inequalities and serving the interests of the powerful. We have to be willing to peel back the layers, examine those hidden power dynamics that are at play.
This is such a powerful way to connect the past to the present. It's like we're not just studying history for history's sake.
Yeah.
We're using it to understand the world around us, the forces that are shaping our lives right now.
Exactly. And it's not just about institutions either. Critical theorists also highlight how those racialized ways of thinking, those hierarchies that were so common in the interwar period, they still influence international relations today.
So those ideas about racial superiority that fueled colonialism and justified exploitation, you're saying they haven't just vanished. They're still lurking beneath the surface, influencing things.
Unfortunately, yes. They've morphed and adapted, sometimes becoming more subtle and insidious. We see it in how certain regions are portrayed in the media, as inherently unstable or prone to conflict, or in those persistent economic disparities between the global north and the global south, those lingering effects of, centuries of colonial exploitation.
So those legacies of racial hierarchy are still shaping perceptions, policies, even if they're not as blatant as they once were. It's like this form of systemic bias that's operating on a global scale.
That's a crucial point. Critical theory encourages us to be vigilant, to constantly question our assumptions and really examine how power and privilege operate, even in seemingly harmless situations.
Wow, this has been an incredibly thought-provoking deep dive into the interwar period. We started with the power politics of realism, then explored those institutional failures of liberalism, delved into that clash of ideologies that constructivism highlights, and finally we uncovered those deep-seated structures of inequality revealed by critical theory.
And the thing is, no single theory can explain everything, right? Each perspective offers a unique lens for understanding this complex and, tragic period in history. But by considering them together, we get a much richer, more nuanced appreciation for all those forces that shaped the world in those decades leading up to World War II.
And maybe even more importantly, these theories give us the tools to analyze the world we live in today, right? They encourage us to question those assumptions, to look beyond the surface and think about how the legacies of the past are still shaping the present. It's like we've been handed this set of keys to unlock a deeper understanding of how global politics really work.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our deep dive, here's something for all you deep divers out there to consider. Could a similar clash of ideologies, an economic crisis, or a disregard for international norms happen again in our own time? And what lessons can we learn from the interwar period to prevent history from repeating itself? These are those big questions, and they really demand our attention and our critical engagement.
Well said. Thank you so much for guiding us through this fascinating exploration. And until next time, deep divers, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deeper.